Hey, greetings. Welcome to April 16th. We're going to have about 3 lectures and a TED Talk for you to view as you head into our time on Zoom on Friday, and then also maybe throughout the weekend as well if it takes you that long to watch them all. But I wanted to start in here. We're making a little shift here in terms of our conversation about reconciliation, and we're moving towards trying to understand the systemic issues. Now, it's not as though we haven't been addressing those throughout. We've had Pastor Irene come talk to us. We've navigated some of the systemic injustices and complexities throughout this course. We've talked about things like redlining. We've heard about these things in the books that we've read thus far, from the Myth of Equality to The Color of Compromise, and now we're into the book South Side. Each one of these, at some level, is addressing systemic inequality and injustice, because you can't talk about racial reconciliation without it. However, as we get into this, I want to deal with something that I think is really important for us to consider as we move forward in this conversation, and that is the divide that often happens within the life of the church in terms of what is our responsibility towards reconciliation, and where does it come from, and how does it happen. And so this lecture set over the course of these 3 to 4 lectures is called Individual versus Corporate Responsibility. And the first lecture that I want to talk to you about it's kind of a devotional thought. It's biblical in terms of its orientation, but it's really sort of a challenge for us to begin the conversation in what we're thinking about in terms of racial reconciliation. So lecture 1 is titled How the Church Uses Jesus. Because when we think about reconciliation, we have to assess the divide that exists between and within the very nature of the church itself. Not just the church in the world or within the world, but within the church itself. And we've talked a lot about the evangelical response, that we are typically more involved and invested in the individual than we are the corporate. But I want to talk about, even in terms of reconciliation, and how justice, equality, and reconciliation emerges is consistent with what we've talked about within the context of evangelicalism. And I want to suggest that the evangelical response in terms of reconciliation often begins with sin. Because to talk about reconciliation, we're talking about what divides us. And what divides us is sin. So sin divides us. And there's this suggestion within evangelicalism that you correct the sin, save the sinner, you improve society. But only nominally so. And I think that's important for us to understand, that within evangelicalism, there's often this eschatological bent that wants to suggest that there's no real improvement of society. Things are doomed to get worse, and the best that you can do is get as many people on the boats, on the life raft as you can, because this ship is going down. And so things may be improved a little bit through just the sense of salvation and sinners being saved and reconciled to God and reconciled to one another and coming into the church. And then there's this sense that the prayer then within the evangelical church is this idea for revival, right? Is that if we can just get revival, if people will just mass accept Jesus, everything will be made right. Now again, this is individualistic in tone, sin-based in terms of my own individual moral responsibility. So the problem with the brokennesses in society is that sinners are doing sinful things. Heal the sin, or break the chains of the sin, heal the sinner, and things will improve. Now, for many progressive Christians, the response is it's not necessarily sin in terms of a moral infraction of the law that divides us. It's the injustices and the systemic mistreatment of the quote-unquote other, right? So what divides us are the inequalities and the oppression and the exploitation that continues to keep people from living into the flourishing of life that they were intended for. You heal the system and you improve the people. So did you hear the nuance there? Correct the sin, heal the sinner, improve the society in evangelicalism, broadly speaking. And then amongst progressive Christians, it's heal the system and you improve the people. So when you look at the systemic issues that are creating the brokenness that is all around us, if you can find ways to improve the system, then people will be better off. They will make better decisions. People are mired in broken systems, and therefore Their decisions are often broken as a result of the systems that they're mired in. And how responsible can you really hold people to be for systems that they didn't create? And what I want to suggest to us here is that both groups, in a sense, use Jesus to support their agenda for reconciliation. So we're reconciled as people are forgiven and people become, as they move from sinner to saint, or people are reconciled as systemic injustices are dealt with, and people are able to move into a sense of flourishing, freed from the bonds of oppression and tyranny. But I want to caution us in the ways in which we try to use Jesus, because I don't know that Jesus is up for use, right? Jesus says, "Come and see, follow me, do as I do," not simply, "How can I be at your service?" And I think that's really important for us to recognize, that Jesus is inviting the church to come and step into the world as he sees it, not as we've already made decisions about it. That's one of the things we're going to talk about in lecture 2, or the TED Talk, and then ultimately what would be lecture 3, is that many of us are already inclined towards perspectives and lenses based upon how we've been shaped to see the world and our moral responsibility to the world, and then we use Jesus to justify that lens. And I think Jesus wants to call into question our lenses, and I think Jesus wants to call into question our either-or thinking. Because if you think about Jesus is not averse to correcting sin. If we think about John 8, where the woman's caught in adultery, and Jesus, in a profound way, places himself between her and her accusers, he flips the script, he reminds them that they are sinners, he recognizes that there's some systemic issues based upon the law that had created this unfair treatment of this woman. But then he says to her, "Go and sin no more." There is within Jesus conviction without condemnation. That reconciliation, healing, restoration does come through a sense of individual moral responsibility. So as people linger in the brokenness of racial inequality, the white church has often assumed, and even portions of the black church as well, that things would be made better if people would just stop doing the broken things they're doing and make better decisions. And in making better decisions, we're able to come towards one another in a sense of trust and without a sense of fear that may open up opportunities for reconciliation. So you can have conviction of personal moral responsibility of the wrongs that have been done without a sense of condemnation. You can have an invitation without a sense of shaming. And I don't think Jesus is averse to personal moral accountability. I think it's possible to speak to the moral ills that are in society without, or I would say the moral ills that individuals do within society, without somehow suggesting that there isn't also systemic injustice. But you can hold people accountable to that. Call people to account for their volitional decisions that break the known will of God. That's sin. And sin needs to be dealt with in terms of the call to reconciliation. But as a prophet, Jesus is also a prophet. He challenges systems. See, prophets speak truth to power, especially in the abuse of power. And so throughout his ministry, Jesus was not only saying to individuals, "Go and sin no more," he was also addressing unjust systems. He would talk about the overreach of religious leaders to control and manipulate the lives of others. He would talk about the systemic inequalities of poverty that existed amongst those that he walked with, and the proclamation and the hope of good news for the poor, and not just the poor in spirit, but the poor materially as well. He understood the implications of the oppression and the injustice and the manipulation and the exploitation of Rome within Israel. He recognized the systemic nature of injustice. That's what prophets do. If you read the prophets in the Old Testament, so Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. If you read the prophets in the Old Testament, they were very intentional about directing challenge to the systemic breakdowns that keep people mired in situations and atmospheres and environments where bad decisions seem to come naturally, right? Because of the context and the conditions and the assumptions that people grow up under and in. um, the assumption of sin as a malady. He calls that into question, that people had made this systemic assumption that sin led to people's broken situations, and if you just heal the sin, their conditions would improve. So, like, if you think about it, the man that Jesus encountered with the blind man, he says, his disciples says, who sinned, this man or his parents? Jesus says, neither. This is so that you can see the will of God. There's assumptions that the problem that people are facing is because of the bad decisions that they're making. If they just made better decisions, their conditions would change. And I think systemic injustices, taking seriously systemic injustices, means that we don't necessarily buy into that as the predominant narrative that shapes and forms people's lives. Jesus seems to suggest that instead of an either or, there's a both and. And it's possible to address and hold accountable each individual for the moral responsibility that they have. To each person has to live in accordance with God's righteously loving, holy, redemptive commands in this world. We can address the individual sin. And secondly, it is possible to address the powers and principalities in their most unjust expressions, calling into question our participation in those systems. And you think about the way in which Matthew and Zacchaeus were both a part of an exploitive system of tax collecting. What does Zacchaeus do when he comes to faith? He makes reparation and restitution, right? And so there is a correcting of the systemic injustices that is often the result of our personal accountability, but then needs to be understood within the context of how do we shape and form new systems that provide people with greater opportunity to live into their flourishing without the bonds and the extreme exploitative injustices that keep people mired in the conditions that they find themselves in. And I think we can also think in terms of how the church embraced this early on, in that when they recognized the inequalities that exist between the rich and the poor, they had a certain degree of egalitarianism, which is this sort of collectivism where they shared what they had. There's an address to the systemic issues that keep people bound and broken. So what I want to suggest to us is that as we approach this topic of reconciliation, it's not just about appropriating Jesus for our own use. It's recognizing that Jesus calls us to follow him, and he does address the personal accountability and moral responsibility, but he also addresses the systemic injustices, and that sets the tenor and tone for where we're going to go for the rest of these lectures.